We live in a world ruled by tyranny, where knowledge is suppressed and ignorance is glorified. A world where propaganda and misinformation travel the airways at the speed of lies. But in the midst of the violence and chaos, a great awakening is taking place. And as the media empires continue to collapse, a new network is forming. A network of truth. A network of courage. A network of awareness. Peace and greetings. You are now tuned into the Network of Awareness podcast radio station, where we examine current events, politics, health, finance, and topics of cultural relevance in America and throughout the world, while bringing you insightful interviews with guests that will both educate and inspire you. And now, your host of the Network of Awareness podcast radio station, ORRA the Informationalist.
Nothing like this.
Just tell me what's happening to me in plain English without the mumbo jumbo.
My aura is a network full of awareness and gifts like ORRA, the Informationalist.
How you doing?
Yes, peace and greetings, brothers and sisters. Welcome to the live broadcast of the Network of Awareness. You're now tuned in with your host, or the Informationalist. And today's episode is episode 95, Empathy in Leadership. And this is an installment of the Truth Seeker series, as we've been doing all this week. And there's going to be a lot of truth brought out by a man by the name of Hans Eric Hageman. And Hans is we're gonna talk a little bit about some of Hans' accomplishments so you can get to know him a little bit better before we bring him on the show. So in this episode of Empathy and Leadership, we're gonna discuss the importance of emotional intelligence in leading teams, driving success, and fostering a positive work environment. And I'm going to interview Hans, who is a graduate of Princeton and Columbia University Law School. He has started and led an organization for underserved children in Harlem, New York, also in Kenya, in Lucknow, India. He is a recipient of the Robin Hood Foundation Heroes Award and the Essence Magazine Award. He is currently the executive director of the Tutwiler Community Education Center, a community and youth development organization located in Mississippi Delta, where he currently resides. And his middle school and high school students learn the educational and healing power of nature and service trips to places like Nicaragua. So Nicaragua, I hope you're tuning in for this one, and Senegal, where they help build a vegetable garden for AIDS patients. His goal is to be an ancestor worth remembering. And I love that statement, an ancestor worth remembering. So, brothers and sisters, without further ado, I'm going to bring on Hans. So let's get this show started, and let's get it started right, shall we? Let's go. All right. Welcome to the show, Brother Hans. How you doing, man?
I am thrilled to be here. This is an honor. Thank you. I'm doing great. It's a great day in the Mississippi Delta.
You know, you look like you could be one of my relatives. You look like you related to my father. You look like my dad a lot, bro.
You never know.
Crazy. You look like my father and my uncles, the Riveras.
I hope that's a good thing.
No, okay. That is a good thing. You know, and they're all alive and well, still, you know, they're up in age and still healthy and vibrant. So no, it's just interesting as I look at you. It's like, you know, it's like I'm looking at my pops. But Hans, I'm honored to have you on the show as well, by the way. And I'm going to get right into it because you grew up in New York, all right, and you grew up in Harlem. And I want to kind of get your perceptions of what growing up in Harlem was like back in the days. Because obviously growing up for me in New York City, you grow up a little faster than most of the world because you're exposed to a lot of things and you're exposed to an environment that's very fast paced and you have to stay on course and keep up with that fast pace. If not, you're left behind. I talked about this the other day about the New York Minute and how growing up in New York City has ingrained this sense of urgency in me to where living in Florida, and I'm pretty sure the same thing for living in Mississippi, things are a lot slower than they are in New York. Extremely a lot slower. So I've developed a great amount of patience and learning how to accept the slower pace of things. So with that being said, without getting into a long-winded question, what was it like growing up in Harlem in New York City for you?
Well, we came to the projects in West Harlem first from Chicago when I was about a year and a half old. But after that, we moved very quickly to El Barrio, Spanish Harlem. And so culturally, it was different from what a lot of people are used to. And the experience of growing up in Harlem was combined with getting a scholarship to an elite private school, collegiate school for boys, founded in 1628. So I had something of a schizophrenic existence where I had this jacket and tie when I was going out to go to school. And then I would come back to this community that was, frankly, for lack of a better term, poverty stricken. And it's one of the reasons my Methodist minister father had come to New York. And where we lived was a residential drug treatment center. And so we had our apartment right on top and then right below 50 to 60 guys, either just out of prison or back from the Vietnam War, another 50 or 60 men and women coming in during the day. And I would get stories and perspective from people whose lives had been stolen, destroyed, and were trying to be reclaimed. And then I would go off to this private school where I would hang out with people like JFK Jr. and the people who make most of the decisions in the world. And so I had to navigate that. And there wasn't a lot of guidance for how that went. And throughout the years, I remember families who, very friendly we would speak to. And then when the crack epidemic hit, the parents became like zombies. And I would have to go to meetings for their children to the school because the parents just weren't capable of doing that. Staying in Harlem and eventually starting a school there. At one point, there were, I think, 2,470 homicides or something during the crack wars. And, those numbers are crazy when I think about it now. And one had to function. One had to find friendships. One had to still figure out how does community work? How do you build a community in the midst of that kind of violence, in the midst of that kind of deprivation from drugs, in the midst of that lack of opportunity for people moving up? So a bit of a schizophrenic existence, but the combination has made me who I am today, and I wouldn't change a thing.
What was the high school you went to?
It was collegiate school for boys. I was there from 2nd grade through 12th grade.
Oh, okay. What's the name of it?
That's the name, Collegiate School for Boys.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, so it was called Collegiate. Okay, got it. Yeah, I went to Fordham Prep.
In New York. Oh, okay. Yeah, no, we knew about Fordham Prep. Yeah.
Yeah.
You all might have been better in athletics in certain respects at Fordham Prep, but we viewed ourselves as being smarter.
I remember that running track. There was a lot of schools that I used to beat out. But I remember going to school, in regards to what you were saying, I remember going to school with the son of the CEO president of Ninex. And this kid had $100 for lunch money.
Right.
And he would get picked up in limos. So I went to school with a lot of kids that were very wealthy when I was in Fordham Prep. And the only reason I got to go was on a scholarship. The unfortunate thing with me is that I dropped out.
Same deal. Okay.
Yeah, I went the wrong route. I went the route of selling drugs and just a whole bunch of crazy stuff in Spanish Harlem. I lived on 117th and 2nd when I ran away from home. So I got to live in Spanish Harlem for a little over a year, but I was, from the Bronx.
Okay.
So I know about just growing up in New York City and coming from one environment to another on a daily basis and kind of seeing almost like a daily transformation of one environment and going literally, it could be a matter of blocks or a couple of miles and just going to a whole different world. And that's what it was like, and I'm pretty sure you experienced this when you would travel, let's say up Lexington Avenue per se, or any of those avenues, First, Lexington. But if you walk from Harlem through Spanish Harlem and you get closer to Wall Street, it's a whole different world. It's like a whole different
even for us, just crossing 96th Street was the boundary on the east side that things all of a sudden became very different.
Yes.
Very different with doormen and, the limousines and everything else. Yeah. Just one street. And we knew that was the dividing line.
So I see here, East 100th Street, you was in a home housed Exodus House, a groundbreaking residential community for drug addiction treatment. The program was founded and run by your father. Can you talk about Exodus House and kind of influence that had on you?
Yeah, we actually moved first before we got to the neighborhood while they were building Exodus House. We moved to East 100th Street. And anybody interested in what it looked like back then should go to this photographic essay by a guy named Bruce Davidson, who wrote a photographic essay called East 100th Street, so they can get a real sense of what that neighborhood looked like. Then once Exodus House was renovated, we moved to 103rd Street. And, we grew up in interesting times, whether it was dealing with what was called the Black Mafia back then, or the Young Lords, the Young Patriots, the Black Panthers, all groups very active in the community trying to organize it. My father was kind of in the middle of a lot of different things there. He testified against police brutality, I think just right after or during what were called the Knapp police commission trials, where people like Frank Serpico testified. And so it was nonstop. The politics were huge there. And so you had that 10,000 foot view. But then you also got the ground level view of every night going back there. And my parents never really trying to figure out how to be parents to their 3 children, but also knowing with this dormitory below us, one flight below or 2 flights, there were 2 dormitories, that there could be a knock on the door at 3 or 4 in the morning with somebody who would try to commit suicide, or somebody who had become violent, or somebody who was missing, or some other problem. And so this place was embedded in us, both at that ground level, but again, also in terms of politics. And one of the things that our parents didn't spend a whole lot of money on our clothes. And there were times going to that fancy private school where I was made fun of for the clothes I would wear. And obviously the fact that I'm still talking about it all these years later, it stuck with me. However, one thing that they didn't deny us was anytime we were at a bookstore and saw a book, didn't matter what the book was about, how expensive the book was, they would buy the book. And as a result, I had that habit now. And traveling to Mississippi, I brought over 1,000 books with me after giving more than 1,000 books away before I left New York. But our parents wanted to make sure that we weren't necessarily consumed with the length of our life, but yeah, they wanted us to live long lives, but they also wanted us to be involved in the times that we were living in, not necessarily be a part, not necessarily be a product of the times, but just know that we should be able to make an impact in the circles that we were moving through. I mean, that was never a question. And it was a vibrant time to be alive. I mean, when you're talking about the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, New York almost going bankrupt, the crime at different parts. And then, you have the people who were cooking, right? Who would introduce you to their culture. So whether it was the remaining Italian families who would make, fresh lasagna, or the pasteles, or the chitlins, that people would make for us. I mean, we're exposed to a variety of things. The Korean grocer that came in and actually provided some of the first fresh food in the community until the husband was shot in the head and killed resisting a robbery, and that closed down our fresh fruit access there. And again, we were on 103rd Street, and just the access to decent, healthy food could be defined by just a matter of a few blocks or a matter of a few dollars. years. And that was something that my parents were always trying to move through and let us know that we had a responsibility to people who had not had the opportunities that we had. And it's not like we had a lot, but the education was what they looked at. The fact that both our parents were healthy and able to contribute to our upbringing. They taught us from an early age that we had a requirement to give back.
Absolutely. And that was the next question I was going to ask. You said you learned courage and the possibilities of the human spirit. How did you gain that awareness at a young age growing up in Harlem? I
would say from when we first, before we got to Exodus House and East 100th Street, we also had lived in various housing projects in New York City. And one of them was Wilson Houses. And, we were in 11G and we would look down over the FDR Drive. And I remember when John Glenn went into space and he came down the FDR in a motorcade with President JFK. Stuff that now it's like, wow, did that really happen? And also in that apartment in 11G in our public housing, there were numerous occasions where our father was planning to make a trip down south to march with Dr. King and other ministers in the civil rights movement. And even at that time, and even though we were very young, we were very aware how dangerous that was. And me, my brother and sister would sometimes sit in front of the apartment door, not letting him out. And he would smile and say, you know what? He says, I'll make it back. And he said, but if I don't, your mom's going to take care of you. He says, but I'm doing what I need to do. And you're telling this to kids, 5, 6 years old. I mean, you got it early on, or during the Harlem, what were called the Harlem riots in 1964, a police shooting of a black teen, I think it was. And a lot of things were burnt in Harlem. And my father was going out and trying to help restore the peace in the community. And again, we were told to stay on the floor because we didn't know about snipers and all this. I mean, again, preteens trying to figure this out, and watching our parents, my mother supporting my father, her going out into communities again to advocate for children whose paths crossed hers. My father fighting the fight both in New York and down south. And at the same time, this is juxtaposed against the picture of privilege at the schools that we attended. We knew that there was an imbalance, tried to figure that out. But we also knew that we were supposed to opt for a life of service and community, and that if the riches and the wealth came, that would be incidental. But we need to have a life again that was well lived and a life of service, so that we would make the lives of less fortunate people better.
So, you became a prosecutor. You went to law school. How many years did you spend in law school before you started practicing law? And how was that experience being a prosecutor? Well,
law school is generally 3 years, and I got out in 3 years. And right after I graduated from law school, I'd also been in the Army Reserve. So I had to do some military training there. And then I came back and worked. I had a lot of debt, both from Princeton and then from law school. And, I had to figure that out. And so I went to work for one of those fancy law firms that people sometimes hear about, and thought I would be a 6-figure salary in my 20s, thought I would be able to pay those loans back. I wasn't as responsible with the money as I should have been. And I wish I knew then what I know now about that. Not that I've absorbed all those lessons still. But at one point, my mother said, I thought you went to law school to, in tongue in cheek, kind of save the world. And here you are working, figuring out mortgage-backed securities and, looking at mortgage instruments. She says, I don't understand how that works, and I don't understand why you're doing that. And that stayed with me. And so I decided, you know what? She's right. That's not why I got into law in the first place. So, I looked around and I said, you know what, let me figure out what's a prestigious, prosecutor's office in New York. And the premier prosecutor's office was Robert Morgenthau, who was the district attorney at the time, legendary in those circles. And it also happened to coincide with the crack epidemic that was starting and that was devastating my community, right? So I went to Robert Morgenthau's office as a Manhattan DA, and the charge there was to do justice, right? So if there were people who were appeared in court who weren't supposed to be there. Our job is to make sure that they don't stay there, right? But at the same time, for people who were, committing crimes, then our job was to bring that evidence forward and hopefully, you get a conviction. And, that was the first, I felt like a real lawyer there. I'm glad I was there for the people I was there for. But I then also got to see, and while I was there, one of my roommates from college at Princeton said, he had taken his law degree. He'd also gone to law school and worked in the United States Senate. And he was going to move on because when you're a lawyer in the United States Senate, the next step is to go to work for a large lobbying law firm where you make a lot of money. And that was his plan. And he says, look, my boss, the senator, won't let me leave unless I find a replacement. And he says, so I'm calling you. And I said, I have no interest in working in Washington. They talk about there are two things you never want to see made. One of them is sausage and the other is law. And he goes, I know, but he goes, ask around. He says, you'll find out that you cannot turn this opportunity down. So I asked my supervisor at the district attorney's office, and he said, who's I think now a federal judge. But he said, he says, you can't turn that down. You have to go. And so I thought I was going to be in the district attorney's office for 5-10 years. That didn't happen. So packed up a U-Haul, my girlfriend, and a young man from the community who his father had been incarcerated and his mother had been killed and tortured in a revenge drug killing. And so he was out there on his own. And I said, come on down with us to Washington. Let's see what happens. So the three of us got in this U-Haul, drove down to Washington, and I worked in the United States Senate as chief counsel to a U.S. Senate subcommittee. I have my Joe Biden cufflinks from that period of time. And I also found out that, they're right. There are two things I'd rather see sausage made than the way laws are made. And I got to see people coming through who had money, who also then had the ear of the different lawmakers there because they had money. And that's how a lot of legislation got drafted, with input from people who had those financial resources. And so my parents' health also was deteriorating at the time. My father had a stroke, which paralyzed him on one side and caused him to be aphasic, so he couldn't really speak. And my mother had developed Parkinson's, and they lived on a 5th floor walk-up, still at the drug treatment center. And it didn't make sense. How were they supposed to make it, 5 flights with those kinds of conditions? And so I then looked around and I saw a new innovative public defender's office opening in Harlem. And I said, well, I've seen the Wall Street thing. I've been a prosecutor. Now I've been in Washington, D.C. at a high level. Let me see what it's like to be on the other side, on the defense side. So then I came back to New York and worked as chief counsel to the Neighborhood Defender Service.
Out of many of my guests, you're one of the few guests that has a very vast amount of experience in a lot of things that you've been able to accomplish. So I'm going to try to get through all of it to bring it out because there's a lot.
And I'm old too. And I'm old too. So
it's one of those things though that you've been able to do a lot of things in a short amount of time. Because I'm looking at, your bio, and it's just like, and then the stuff that you're bringing out, because for me, I would have loved, I know that I was born for this time, and what I'm doing now is what I was meant to do by the Most High. But I would have loved to live and got to see a lot of things that you were able to see, because the 60s to me was like, it was action packed. I mean, There was just so many things happening during the 60s. It was amazing. And because of that is kind of where we're at now, where they kind of locked down a lot of things and suppressed a lot of things in the human spirit based on those times, because those times people were being awakened on mass levels. So the governments and the powers that shouldn't be really took a lot of time in cultivating and engineering socially different ways to suppress the consciousness of humanity and of people becoming aware of what their experience should be instead of what it was being programmed to be by these powers and these, this enslavement. So let's talk about that a little bit, because it says here that you started independent schools. Through your law practice, you started independent schools in Harlem for children who were not successful in public school. And running these schools says that you showed you directly how the impact the school to prison pipeline had, and providing a nurturing environment for creative students who are non-traditional learners. I know this all too well about the school to prison pipeline, especially in in places like New York, metropolitan areas like New York, Detroit, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, these places where it's these inner city places where it really just, and I remember my daughter saying this to me. My daughter said this to me, I think at 10 or 11 years old. She was like, Dad, I feel like school is like prison. And I was like, why is that? And she was like, well, they tell you when to eat. They tell you to walk in a line. You have to walk in a line behind other people and all these things she was saying to me. And I was like, wow, you figured that out on your own. That's pretty impressive. And what I wanted to ask you is, how was that experience? Like this whole show is about empathy and leadership, right? And empathy is all about, on a basic level, is about putting yourself in putting yourself in someone else's shoes, understanding their pain, understanding their struggles, understanding just their life, and being able to feel that energetically and being able to empathize for somebody. It takes a lot in the world we live today, because I have this whole narcissism series. And I talk a lot about narcissism because especially here in the United States, most of this country's population, as far as mentally, is based off of narcissism. And we all have traits of it because we can't really exist or survive in this toxic environment without having some narcissistic tendencies in order to survive. But you also have straight narcissists, 100% full blown, that thrive in this environment. We had a president like that recently. And I think the president now, I think Biden is like that, but I think that Trump was that on steroids. And people gravitate to that. People gravitate to that egoic, narcissistic mindset because it's all about me mentality. So to be an empath, which it seems, would you consider yourself to be an empath, by the way?
I have. I'm still working with that. And we can talk further about what that means. But yeah, I have considered myself to be a very strong empath. Yes.
Based on your credentials, I think you are. But let's talk about this. What inspired you to want to help educate children and the impact of the prison to the school to prison pipeline, and how you perceive that and what you chose to do to counteract that manner of teaching the kids, because it's not, I don't even really consider education. It's really something else. I don't even know what to put it in words, but what inspired you to want to counteract this negative way of leading children to their demise, pretty much?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things. One maybe perhaps too much information. However, when I was a preteen, around 10 years old, my parents, again, we didn't have a lot of money, and they were always looking for ways to do better for us. And they had some friends who told them about medical care, and this doctor at Rockefeller University, held in high esteem. He'd been practicing for a long time, and he was going to take on some pro bono patients. I happened to be one of those patients. He happened to be a serial pedophile. And as a result of that experience, which I was never able to share with my parents, I was determined, because post-traumatic growth, which is a term now, but it wasn't a term then, but it was just understood that if you experienced trauma in my house, you were supposed to grow through that. And so whatever trauma I may have experienced turned into reflections of, when I grow up, I'm going to be at least the one adult in any child's life who they'll be able to trust. So that was part of that formation. And that has stayed with me. And then I got to see up close. I would be in court as a prosecutor, and I would have young people being charged with whatever crime, and they would say, I don't like my defense attorney. I want that man. I want that man. He seems to care more, pointing to me. And the judge would say, no, his job, and it was not exactly correct, but his job is to put you in prison. So you can't have him represent you, right? And during that time, I would also go to teach street law classes at different public schools, and I saw the teachers who cared, and in the communities I grew up in, and I saw the teachers who really didn't. I know that there was one teacher, happened to be a white man in this school that's now Frederick Douglass Academy. Before that, I don't know what it was called, but I also know in that school, I would go there, and literally I would see, there was one time I saw a fire in one of the classrooms that had been set by the students. Another time a chair was thrown through the window by some of the students. This was a middle school. They didn't do that in this man's class. And he was the only one who responded when I offered to teach street law classes. And so I taught my street law classes. We went on field trips, and his kids respected him because they saw the depth of his care and concern for them. Then a few years later, this school became a shining star of the education system in New York. But what they did was they kicked out all the students that they had in that school, the one setting fires, the one throwing chairs. And they then interviewed students to come into the school as part of the new charter legislation that had come into New York. The school I had started had predated charter legislation. So it was an independent school. But we decided that when it came to wellness in terms of nutrition, exercise, questioning the things that were out there in the world, we were going to do something different from the prison that you talked about your daughter was mentioning. John Taylor Gatto, he died a couple of years ago, but he was one of my heroes. Gatto, wrote books called Dumbing Us Down, and some other books about the public school system that resonated completely with me. I mean, we had kids who had not been functioning well in public school for a variety of reasons who thrived with us. And I know that, and the school's still running 32 years later. My brother is still running things there. So obviously for it to have that kind of a staying power means that we had done, and he continues to do something right. I get calls from kids who I worked with 15, 20, 30 years ago saying that experience was the thing that set me up, right? And how many middle school students in one case, and then another case when I set up a high school, take the time and or have the desire to figure out who was that principal, who was that head of school in my middle school. I want to call him after 20 or 30 years and thank him for making me who I was. And at the same time, I also do recently in the past month, I've had 2 young men, both in their 30s, Black males, call and say, we're struggling. We try to remain positive, but there are not a lot of positive influences here in New York. And I think they're both in the Bronx. And they said, we hope you don't mind. And independently, they don't even know each other. We wanted to reach out to you because we remember the Boy Scout troop, or we remember the trips to Montana that we took, or we remember how you taught us how to debate and think for ourselves. And they're reaching out all these years later as grown men because they remember that connection that they didn't get in other places where they had gone to school. And so, coming down to Mississippi at this late stage in my life, professionally and personally, it just reinforces the need. It remains in New York, and people have defined success in a certain way over the last several decades, and a lot of it is keeping score in terms of wealth and title and position. And the work of the mind is valued over the work of the heart and the hands. I think that's going to have to change just because of how the world is going. But that then doesn't leave a lot of spaces for kids to fully experience. Kids who in fact are empathic, or a term that I'm embracing more and more, kids who are compassionate. You're not rewarded for that in the society we live in. So, all those motivate me to keep doing what I do.
Yeah. The reason why is because we are in a narcissistic world. We're in a world where it's self-worship, and social media has really taken that to a whole nother level, to where people are egoically driven for self-fulfilling desire. And the whole ego thing that I talk about that was brought to my attention when I was 20 was the acronym for ego is edging God out. It's where you edge yourself out from everything that is and ever will be that you are connected to. And we are spiritual beings having a physical experience. So it's one of those things where when you stop seeing yourself in that light, now your light gets dim and you start to see yourself separate from others. You start to think that you're special, and that puts you on a course of narcissistic behavior, and it gets rewarded. That's the problem. It gets rewarded. Statistically, in corporate America, anybody who is narcissistic in their mindset is going to always make more money than the person that's empathic or compassionate, 10 times out of 10. And that's just the way it is.
I found that out the hard way. Yeah.
It sounds like you did. But I truly believe that the empathic person is living a more fulfilling life. And I know from what I've seen and what I've studied and people that I've talked to from around the world and stories that I've heard and stuff that I've seen for myself, that a lot of these people that are narcissistic, that don't repent for their sins and their wrongdoings and their transgressions, their demons wind wind up waiting for them when they transition. And that's not a pleasant experience at all. Because a lot of people think that when you die, that's it, it's over. It's like so far from the truth, you know? It's a whole new beginning to something that was already there. And you get a full understanding of it when you leave your body. But
right.
How has it been, you know, you helping these children in different countries? Because you help children in India and Africa, which these countries that you help, they also listen to this show. So that's a good thing. How has it been, like, this journey that you've been on helping people? You've helped a lot of people throughout your life. So I definitely consider you to be an empath. But it says here that you've started these organizations and you've led some of these organizations. It says you also were a consultant for a groundbreaking program in police training, which you talk about street laws. So what was the driving force that made you want to do all of this nonprofit, community organizing and educational work for the youth?
Part of it was having seen my mother deal with Parkinson's and my father at the age of 51 have his stroke. And when he was in the hospital, the first hospital was a public hospital. And the doctors told my mother, you need to get in touch with your children because he's not going to make it. And she's like, you need to slow down. She scraped some money together for a private ambulance to take him to another hospital, which allowed him, with the paralysis and the inability to talk, to live for another 16 years. But that's kind of, you know, who she was. And I saw, and so we went to that hospital and we asked the doctors about our father's prognosis long-term. And they said it wasn't great. And they said, but you should also be aware that, you know, you and your brother may have the same type of arterial venous malformation that he had in his brain. And so around 50, you need to be prepared for the same thing to happen to you. Right. So a couple things happened, right? One was at 50, I was actually waiting for that to happen because after all, these are the experts, right? These are the professionals, these doctors. And they delivered that message. And at that time, I, you know, despite my other travails from early on as a preteen, like I mentioned with the medical system, I believed them to a certain extent. And if that wasn't enough, when I started that first school with my brother, we had interfered with the crack traffic and the crack selling in front of our school. And as a result, the family that ran the traffic and the blocks around there took out contracts on our lives. And so there were times I would sit in the school because I would be there to open it at 6:30 in the morning and usually close up around 8 because I was providing hot meals. Twice a day, I would be cooking meals in addition to everything else I did for the school. And then there were kids who just wanted to stay there because nobody was home. They wanted to wait around. So then I would be the one closing up. And there'd be times I'd walk out on the street and guys across the street would laugh and open their jackets to show me their handguns. And one of them said, "Oh, you never know when tonight's going to be the last night." Okay. And so I ended up, thanks to the New York Police Department, getting an expedited carry permit, which I'm sure they would never do now. But they said, you know, you can get 24-hour protection and or you can protect yourself. We'll expedite you getting a carry permit and tell you where we buy our body armor. So for a couple of years, I carried a handgun, right? Not knowing if, again, as those people told me, this is going to be your last night. And so I never knew, you know, was I going to make it past 35? Was I going to make it past 40? Was I going to make it past 45? And here I am now at 65. But before that, it was always kind of a race to do as much as I could with the time that I had. I mean, I look back on people like my father or Dr. King or other people like that who in relatively short time spans accomplished so much. And I didn't want to feel like I was going to be lagging behind. So there was always this rush to take on as many things as I could: community development, nutrition programs, outdoor education, starting schools overseas, bringing kids together from the Harlem community to places like Nicaragua or Senegal or Ghana. You know, there was always this urgency. And it still remains. I don't know, none of us do, right? How much time is left? I've been blessed to have now, as I said, 65 years, but there's still this urgency because if somebody is put in front of me and they haven't had the breaks that I've had, much less the people of you know, material wealth, the breaks that they've had, you know, how am I supposed to whom much is given, much is expected? And how am I supposed to ignore those people that are put in front of me? So it's always been a race, and I go where I've felt felt called. So that's what it is. And, the kids from Harlem got to see kids in Ghana and Senegal and places like Nicaragua and saw how those kids lived. And they realized that those kids were there just by virtue of where they were born. And that in New York, as hard as they had it, they could still make something of themselves, because those opportunities were going to be that they have to work harder than some other people, but the opportunities were there that weren't present in some of the other places that they were fortunate enough to visit on service trips. So that's some of that.
You and I have lived similar lives when it comes to environment, because you grew up in New York City. I grew up in New York City. You lived in the Hudson Valley area. I lived in the Hudson Valley area as an adult. I lived in Orange County and in Rockland County.
Okay.
And some of Westchester too, because I lived in Yonkers for a year. And then I moved to the South, which I never thought I'd be in the South.
Wow.
And here you are,
same
in Mississippi
Same.
Delta. So how did you wind up in the Mississippi Delta? Because I can tell you from my personal experience, I never thought I'd be living in Florida. I've been to Florida plenty of times since a kid. Never thought I'd live here. Really wasn't even interested in the South like that. And here I am. So what led you to moving to Mississippi Delta? Because I know that Mississippi, when it comes to racism, it's a big problem in the South. But what I like about the South is that it's a little bit upfront, which I can appreciate. But it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. And but it still does exist, and I know it exists in Mississippi. But besides all that, I shouldn't even have asked that question. But what is it like? Like, how did you wind up in Mississippi?
To be honest, when I was doing the police training that you had mentioned, I had actually gone to Mississippi, and there was a show on TV also called Judge Hatchett, with one of these reality shows. And she would bring people in to intervene in people who are having interesting lives or challenges in their lives. And one segment where I was called in to intervene as kind of a counselor was to a young man in Mississippi. So the show flew me down to Mississippi, and there was nothing in this woman's, two room house. They were burning all the garbage on the front lawn. Obviously, her son was having issues. I'm like, you know what? I'm once I do this, I am never coming back to Mississippi. I subsequently did for some training to train some police cadets. But I said, how does anybody live down here? And it was not on my radar. I had been in military police school in Alabama. I was in officer training school in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, 101st Air Mobile School in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. But it was mission focused. And in the Hudson Valley, I kind of like the Hudson Valley. I like the environment. I was running a garden-based instruction nonprofit. I started a program in a maximum security prison for teenage boys around vegetable gardening and actually yoga. That was a harder sell than the vegetable gardening for those boys. I had three boys who were there for murder, under the age of 16. But I was making a difference. I actually started the first breathwork certification course for incarcerated teens in New York State. I'm surprised New York State approved it, but they did. And I figured it's called a free roll in gambling. If you don't take it, you're not going to win anything. If you take it and you lose, you're not going to lose anything. And so let me apply to New York State to try to do that. Right. So I was doing some good things there. And then in February, I can't remember the day, but February 2022, I'm drinking my coffee at 6:30 in the morning, and I hear a knock on the door. I'm like, what? Who's here? We had 5 acres. Who's this? And there was some heavyset guy, white guy, with tattoos and so forth. And so I didn't know what was getting ready to happen. And he says, look, brother. He says, I'm not here for trouble. I'm not here for trouble. He says, I'm just here on business. And I'm like, what kind of business? Right. I opened the door, and he hands me something. He says, you've been served. And my wife of 20-something years had decided that she no longer wanted to be married to me. So, I then quickly had to figure out what I was going to do with my life. My kids were teenagers at the time. And my son now is 21. 2 other kids are grown. And my youngest was then, I guess, 15. And so I looked at a couple of places, and I said, I've got to change things up. I can't stay here. I was going to try to keep the house and all that. And that I just, with COVID and everything else, I wasn't sure what that was going to look like. And, I asked God and the universe to show me where I needed to be next. And again, in the spirit of post-traumatic growth, I asked for a place where I could be of the most use and the most service. And that wasn't in a couple of places that I had been a finalist for. And they said, your heart's not here, where I would be making, well over $150,000 a year to run a nonprofit, and that would be nice. But it would be the same kind of thing that a lot of nonprofits do, where I wouldn't necessarily be able to make the difference. And then this place, Tutwiler Community Education Center, came across my radar, I believe, as a result of my asking God in the universe to show me where I needed to go next. And I don't know how I found it, because I've asked them. I said, did you advertise nationally? And I can't, I can't find them. Maybe they did, but I don't know how. And the other candidates for this position were all from Mississippi. So if they did advertise nationally, it wasn't a big draw. And trust me, the salary here was not what I was used to. I hadn't made this little money in 30 something years. But I saw that it had been started by some nuns in the 80s who had done research and tried to find the poorest communities in the United States. And Tutwiler was one of the communities they identified. Tutwiler, of the communities they identified, it was the only one that got back to them. And so they came and set up a medical clinic. And from that medical clinic grew a community center. And that's what I'm running now in an area of the country where, 99% Black in the town, all American descendants of slavery. Mississippi, and particularly the Delta, has the shortest lifespan in the United States, the lowest academic outcomes, the highest obesity rates, and on and on and on. So my question, I think, so far has definitely been rewarded with the appropriate answer and to where I can possibly be the most service.
Yeah, that's amazing. By the way, I have in the description box the website, which is Tutwiler Community Education Center.org. So if brothers and sisters want to look into that website, it's on there, as well as the coachhans.ck.page. This is a guide to finding your innate resiliency after a setback. I was just thinking here, my mind was racing here as I'm talking to you, because I definitely want to have you come back on the show, multiple times. And, because you have education in street law, you obviously are an attorney. You're well versed in law, but you're also well versed in the understandings of how discrimination works in law, especially in places like New York City. I have a brother in my church that I belong to, the BOCC. It goes by Lamad. And he's actually a police officer, soon to retire in the next year or two or whatever. And I've had him and another brother come on to the show. They're both police officers in New York City. They were on the Chosen 12. Did you ever get to see the documentary Crime and Punishment with 12 officers? Was the 12 New York City officers that pretty much went against and sued the New York City Police Department for having them issue false summonses and citations to rack up numbers. So they went against that, and it was a big documentary. It's international. Wow! If you ever get to check it out, it's called Crime and Punishment. I will look for that. Yeah, it's definitely great. They're on there, and I've had them come on the show a couple of times. And I like to do a show with you and them together, where we can talk about these erroneous laws and statutes that are out here, as well as, just the way policing is done these days. Because I don't want to run over on that, but I had one of my heroes. He claims I'm his hero, but one of my heroes was a kid from the community whose father was a single parent raising 4 kids, Vietnam veteran. And this kid, Dino, was a police officer for 20 years. His career ended and Dino was Puerto Rican, when he was off duty and witnessed a black livery cab driver being beaten by several white men who turned out to be cops who had been drinking in the bar next door. He intervened, identified himself. Apparently they didn't hear it because he was beaten along with the cab driver. Then after everything was sorted out, he was told, look, just claim you didn't identify yourself and everything will go away. He says, I'm not going to do that. He says, you shouldn't have been beating that man and you shouldn't have been beating me. And so they took his badge and his gun. For 5 years, he had to fight this. And the Village Voice in New York did a story on him. And the guy was a hero cop at the time and a former Marine. And he was reinstated and immediately then retired. But a guy like that, again, has been a hero of mine. And he's somebody I brought up to
in my police trainings as to, where is your North Compass as you do your job, right? So I'm sorry to, throw that in, but he came to mind.
Maybe he can come on my show as well.
Okay, I'll ask him.
Because I have, like I said, those 2 police officers from that documentary, and one of them I know pretty well now because I congregate with him, and they live out in New York City. I was just with them on the Passover with him, with Lamad.
Okay.
And I would like to have, like a council of people on my show, because I can have up to 10 people on my show at one time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Wow. So having, 3 or 4 guys on the show talking about, policing and laws, and I think it would be a great show. Because I did a show with them called Erroneous Law Enforcement. And the law enforcement these days is very erroneous. It's very suspect, to say the least. And even though race and all that stuff, which we all know is a big illusion, but even though race plays a big part of it, it's more of just a mindset, and a lot of it stems from leadership and from the top down. But so I was just thinking that, because I think you would provide great substance for a show like that, especially with your background and things you've been able to see. And you're 65 years old. You look good for your age. You look good for your age.
Thank you.
And you've seen a lot and done a lot. And this thing with Tutwiler Community, right? How long have you been involved in this since you started till present day?
I'm in my 4th month here. So it's still new, and learning about small southern neglected communities. It's been quite an education. It's
quite amazing, right? Some of the stuff you see in some of these towns, and how broken down they are, and they're just like, it's almost like it's abandoned. It's abandoned economically.
Right. And that's why there's a lot of pressure, because I have been told that if I let, the words are, if I let the center fail, then the whole town is going to die. And like, well, okay, that's a lot of pressure. Let's see what happens, Well,
hopefully you can excel under pressure. Usually empaths do. Also, too, I went to New Orleans. We want to talk about filth, and we come from New York City. We know what dirt looks like. We know what dirty streets look like. But I'm going to tell you, the amount of filth and just the environment in New Orleans for me was just like, damn. I was like, this is horrible.
Wow.
It's horrible.
All right, that's good for me to know, because I've gotten invitations and I've held off. But hearing that, I think I know what my response is going to be.
Yeah, let me tell you, there's a level of poverty in New Orleans, and just the mindset. It's not good. It's not good at all. I felt a little like, I'm not going to say I felt sick, but I felt like this is an environment that is very, very like, almost like a third world. It's very reflective of like what's happening in Los Angeles with Skid Row. I mean, that over there is getting horrible day by day, but America is getting horrible overall, and I noticed that the one thing I like about the South, though, and I want to hear from you as well. One thing I like about the South is the South has a certain level of resiliency when it comes to sticking to moral principles, opposed to other places around this country, like up north or the Northeast, where they in the Northeast, in my opinion, and that's why I was happy that I was out of there, especially during the pandemic. It's like they're subjecting themselves to being conditioned to become these liberal environments that are very detrimental to the well-being of children, especially with this whole movement for transgenderism and the whole giving homosexuals all these rights and making heterosexual people look like they're the abomination, like they're the ones that are the problem now. And also demasculate, or I think the proper term is demasculating, if that's the word. But it's like they
emasculating,
emasculating. Okay, you're emasculating young boys, and they're making girls become more masculine. So in New York, hold on, I muted myself. Sorry about that. In New York City, my friends are telling me that it's a big problem, the whole transgender movement. So I just noticed that with the South, they don't really play. Cause I'll tell you, like living here in Florida, I love it. I didn't think I was. But when the pandemic hit and my governor, Ron DeSantis, started laying down the hammer with certain things. I appreciated him for that. You know, and I'm not a political guy.
I can imagine.
I'm not a political guy. I know a lot about politics, but I really don't care for it. It's like it's not relevant to me in my experience in this world. I operate off the Spirit. I operate off the Most High God. That is my reality, and I can change that reality based on that truth through the Most High working through me. But what I noticed about the South is the South is kind of cool with not succumbing to these social ills and social conditioning and engineering that's really been on hyperdrive for the past 5 or 10 years now.
Yeah, no, being here for me has been kind of a throwback in terms of those kinds of things, 20 years. And it's I'm allowed to relax. I don't have to worry so much about what I say. Is what I'm saying politically incorrect? Is it do I need to put my pronouns here and all this other stuff? It's none of that here.
Yeah. Yes. It's kind of refreshing, isn't it?
No, it really is. Yeah, it is. It allows me to focus, in my opinion, on what are the actual problems that need to be addressed.
So how much time do you have left, by the way? Because we're about an hour in.
Yeah, well, I'm the boss. So in theory, my people will deal without me till I get back.
Okay. No, because I want to continue this conversation with you. With the work that you're doing now, so you said you've only been there 4 months. What are you looking to accomplish, especially with the youth? And let's talk about this emotional intelligence that I gathered from your profile here about empathy leadership. Like, what are you looking to accomplish with your empathy leadership and also educating the youth in regards to emotional intelligence, which I think is vitally necessary for the youth these days?
Well, some of it is how do people live in community in a powerful way? And this place has been so broken down in so many ways for so many decades because of the loss of jobs and opportunity, a crumbling education system, and so forth. And a lot of the kids here don't know what they don't know. And so they're going to be carpenters, which is good, plumbers, a few of them, which is also even better, or truck drivers, and not understanding that there are going to be 2 to 3 million job losses because of artificial intelligence and self-driving vehicles. So that they may have a good run of 5 to 10 years, then all of a sudden, what are they going to do? And no one's preparing them for that. They'll kind of whisper that they want to be in the trades when in fact those are going to be the jobs that are going to show the most resilience in this coming epoch of technology taking over. But again, we're in a society that values the head over the heart and the hands. And so for me, some of it is trying to get them to recognize the beauty and dignity of that kind of work, whether it's working in a hospice or building a bookcase, right? And not only just the dignity, but the beauty and figuring out how they can be self-reliant in terms of the food that they have. Because here it's 45 minutes each way if you have the means to get there for any type of real food. Even the dollar store that was here, 2 of them in the county have been burned down mysteriously in the last year. And so there are 2 restaurants in my town. One of them closed 2 days ago and the other one's open 3 days a week. Right. So there are a few initiatives. One is getting kids to think about how they can be self-sufficient in terms of their health, but also in terms of their income, and starting small cottage industry businesses that can either be side hustles or whatever. But there's also this attitude of lassitude and hopelessness, where a lot of times their role models are people who are figuring out how they can collect Social Security or disability as soon as possible. And so there's an issue with work ethic. But again, that's because they see jobs either at that dollar store that burnt down as the only option, or going to Memphis to work in a big Amazon warehouse or something to that effect, and not seeing anything else on the horizon. So part of it for me is getting these kids out to see the wider world. And for better or worse, seeing the wider world in this place means going to Alabama or Arkansas. I'm thinking bigger than that, but just even being able to do that. I'm trying to start a series of community vegetable gardens so that people can grow their own food and perhaps have some backyard chickens so they can understand what it means to eat healthy and fresh. And worst case, if things get shut down in terms of supply chains and so forth, have the opportunity to take care of themselves and feed themselves. it's also around having discussions about not letting things happen to them, developing both, again, that attitude and desire for post-traumatic growth, and also developing an internal locus of control. Instead of letting things happen to you and shrugging your shoulders and say, I had no choice. It's like, no, you do have more choices and options than you realize. And some of that's going to come about through being more active and involved in terms of civic engagement. Some of it is them taking stock of themselves and saying, what's most important? I've asked kids, what do you value most? What virtues do you think are important? And that's a hard conversation here because they haven't been given the vocabulary for that. I said, well, let's talk about love. Let's talk about compassion. Let's talk about courage. Let's talk about self-mastery. Let's talk about wisdom. And those are some hard discussions because they don't have the vocabulary. They haven't had those modeled for them in any significant way. But if they're going to develop their own North Star and way to move through life in a way that has integrity and soul and purpose, those are some of the discussions that we're going to have.
So in the short time that you've been there, what do you see as a positive for right now? That, because there is a lot of hopelessness in the South that I've witnessed myself. But what have you seen as far as a positive when it comes to the youth that gives you hope and motive or inspiration to see things in a more optimistic manner?
Some of them may appear strange to some people, but one of the things, we're subject to a lot of tornadoes and severe weather here. And, my gym at the community center got flooded with 2 inches of water. And so I, got a text from the one restaurant across the street saying, your place is flooded. Just wanted to let you know. And I was like at 4 a.m. after my lights had been taken out by the passing tornado. And so I got up. I'm like, I'm not going over there at 4 a.m. because I don't know what that's going to look like. But got up early and just started clearing the water out. And these 2 people that ran the restaurant, came and spent 7 hours with me, getting the water out of there. That cut into how much money they could have made that day. But they wanted to make sure that the new guy would get some help. I have an incredible staff that we're still trying to work some things out, between them, that is a result of people coming in with other leadership styles that were not as compassionate or empathic or heart-centered. And so that's created some tension before I got there. So we're trying to work through those. But individually, they have a tremendous commitment to the community and particularly to the young people there. We also serve senior citizens. That's a different kind of challenge. So it's those people that I work with. There are people in surrounding towns who want to collaborate. And so that's heartening. And, then there's a study that I saw that says a Columbia professor did a study, like, what does it take for how many people does it take in a population to peacefully overturn a government that's corrupt and causing problems? And I think the percentage was something like 3.5%. So I'm in a town with a declining population and we're probably around 1,500 people. So I look at 3.5%. That's not a huge climb to make, to find those people. And the challenge, though, is in any place, and particularly in small towns, I think there is this phenomenon of what are called cave people. And I just was acquainted with that recently. And that's citizens against virtually everything. Cave people. So they it does any kind of change, it's bad because that's not the way it was done before. And so there are a lot of conversations. Some of them I have to bring in scripture because of where we are to get them to understand my point. And then also to get them to realistically look around them and say, well, who are you pointing to as examples of the old days being the better days? And how is that going to serve these children coming up behind you? And if you're exhausted and don't have the energy to figure out ways that these children don't have to lead the lives that you've led, then just get out of the way. So there are those conversations. And, I've reached out to people I've known in my other lives. And so, for instance, in May, I'm going to have 2 women coming from California, and they're very Californian. But I think that's a good and interesting thing. One woman is an independent film producer. She worked at Meta/Facebook as a project manager, and she has a certain perspective of life. This is a Black woman. And so these kids, particularly women, are going to see somebody, who looks like them, who has a California vibe and a very different kind of life experience. And having that kind of example, I think, is going to be important. Her friend is coming from California. She's a kid's life coach. I think that's going to be eye-opening for a lot of people. And they're going to talk about things like aromatherapy, which I like, by the way, and how to get in touch with intuition. And these are things that people down here don't it hasn't really been introduced to them, particularly the young people. So that's going to be good. I've got a former student of mine who is a famous makeup artist, not just in New York, but she was at the Oscars. She's going to be doing the Met Gala, where everybody who's anybody in New York and around shows up, and she does makeup for these people. And we're first going to do a Zoom, but then she's trying to get sponsors from the major makeup companies to send makeup kits down here. And she's going to teach these young women down here how to start their own side makeup business. So it's bringing in those kinds of outside resources. It's getting the young people to think bigger. Then there's the practical stuff. Like all the boys here want to play football or basketball. So I had to raise money to redo the weight room for the basketball team. And at our center, it's something I would never have spent this much money on. But there's a basketball shooting machine called Dr. Dish. And so I raised money just for the Dr. Dish, because that's going to get them in through the door. And then it's up to me to have the conversation about your basketball will improve. You're going to become a better athlete, but let's talk about how you become a better person. And so that's the challenge coming up. But I'm hustling as fast as I can.
Well, speaking of helping them to become a better person, you mentioned the scriptures? Is the scriptures being something that's focused on in these communities?
Yes and no. I mean, you see the statistics that 5-10 years ago, whatever, 62% of people were either regularly attending church or whatever it is, and now 38% or something like that of people do. This is on the face of it, it's a very Christian community, but and most of these churches are Baptist. I go to a United Methodist church and I like it, but you'll see it's the same 15 or 20 people in the congregation. Some of the Baptist churches do better, but they don't do better with the young people. And that's another challenge. I've got two kids who, I thought I was just going to be here relaxing, kind of doing my job to the extent that's relaxing. But, they're these two brothers who I've seen in the street playing around abandoned cars, 8 years old and 9 years old. And, one of the things I'm going to be doing, I'm hoping, again, I speak to the mother and the grandmother, is like, can I take them to church with me on Sunday? Right. And I'm most likely going to get a yes. And in other places like New York, I may not have even asked, but here it's like, I'm not going to do it. But if you want to do it, go ahead, because that's just understood that there's supposed to be some kind of foundation. But then you talk to other people who are bitter because they don't believe that the faith has been brought into the street, that in terms of actions and the church being more active in the lives of people, that I guess it's felt that some of the church leaders here are more condemnatory than they are builders, and so that keeps a lot of the kids away.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think there's a lot of people that are very condemnatory when it comes to spirituality and scriptures, and it goes back to that lack of empathy and compassion, which is a big problem here in the United States. I'm pretty sure it's a big problem around the world, but I know that in the United States, it's probably one of the biggest problems. And the world is starting to realize that the United States of America, which I call the United Shenanigans of America, is not all that it's cracked up to be. It's not as great as people think it to be. And I'm finally happy to understand that people around the world that I talk to understand that, because that's one thing I make very clear when I do my shows. I'm like, conspiracy is not a theory. This place sucks. Like, it's not that great. There's a lot of problems here. All right. And the people what makes this country great is really the people. It's not the country itself. So the people are great here, but not the country. That's why this whole make America great again. I was like, when was America ever great? America was built up of rape, torture, propaganda. That's what America was built up. That's the foundation. Death, just a lot of negative stuff that this country was built on. It's built on the backs of a lot of melanated people too, and on the deaf. And there needs to be a balance in terms of understanding the biblical origins of the Constitution and how do we better live into those things that maybe throughout our history as a country we haven't lived up to, but they still serve as the basis for any country that's going to do anything that's important and powerful and spiritual. So, a good thing in Mississippi, if there's a teen, like so many teens are, is going through an emotional crisis, you can refer them to the
the Bible for guidance and solace. And, then unfortunately, there are fewer places in the United States that you can do that with, so.
Right. Well, since we're closing in about an hour and a half, I could talk to you for a long period of time about many different things, but I'm going to keep it shorter because, 90 minutes to keep people's attention span is asking a lot these days.
Yes.
But with that being said, is there any final comments that you want to make in regards to what we've talked about or anything else you want to mention before we end the broadcast?
No, I just, for people to stay tuned. I one of the things from I mentioned these two young men who are in their 30s, former students of mine at different stages in my career, who reached out to me, and I've run across them the idea of perhaps forming a men's community for young men who are in need of community and support, and talking about what does it mean, what does it look like to build a better man. And so I'm hoping to get a membership community along those lines. I'm also going to ask and urge people to figure out how they can become, an ancestor worth remembering or an ancestor worth claiming, and what kind of, and I don't know who has the quote, but what kind of trees can they plant under whose shade they will never sit, but that will serve the people coming after them. So,
wow, that's great. And by the way, that was another thing I wanted to ask. I'm glad that you mentioned that. I wanted to ask you about why did you choose to that slogan that you want to be an ancestor worth remembering?
I had played around with a lot of different things, and I don't know how that came to me. And so, I throughout my life, there were people who were counting on me to become a United States senator, right? Or to create a not just one school, but a chain of schools, right? So all these huge, fantastic accomplishments were supposed to be, the crown jewel in my life. And the older I've gotten, the more I realize that none of those things mean anything. And it's for what I'm doing, I envision, I guess the guy named, was it David Brooks or whatever, calls them, you've got to decide between your resume virtues, which are the things I just talked about, or your eulogy virtues. And I have envisioned how I want people to think of me, to talk about me, to remember me when I'm gone. And it's enough to say, wow, we remember him and remember that time. And that's enough. It's not like remember that chain of whatever, or think about his bank account or what. No, remember that time where he actually paid attention to me and my humanity. That's good enough for me.
Well, that's beautiful. All right. Well,
thank you.
I want to thank you for coming on to the show. I hope this is not going to be the last time. I would like for you to come back on multiple occasions when, obviously when you have time in your schedule that you and I can set up for you to come on the show, because I think you bring a lot of great substance on here. And also the other thing I wanted to mention is that there's anything I can do to support what you got going on right now in Mississippi, just let me know. Because I am going to be traveling a lot to congregate with my fellow brothers and sisters in the Body of Christ Church and doing stuff with them. So I'll be traveling to Georgia a lot, to Alabama. I am going to try to make some trips to Connecticut and New York again, because I haven't been there since I came to Florida, and I've been here for 7.5 years now. And it's crazy because I thought I'd be going to New York, at least once in the past 7.5 years. And I haven't. And what's interesting is that I don't miss New York. I really don't. I miss some of the people that are there, but I don't miss the environment. I actually kind of embrace the South for what it is. And I know that this is where I'm supposed to be right now. I know this is where the Most High God has placed me, right? To do the good work, to serve the Most High in the way that He wants me to. And you've been doing a lot of great work. Yeah. If I can be half the man you are, I'm in a good place. I'll be in a good place, because you've been able to accomplish a lot. And the fact that you're still doing it, it says a lot about who you are as a spiritual man of the Most High. So really appreciate what you're doing. And for all the people that are listening to this broadcast, that are going to be downloading the show after we finish this, like I mentioned earlier, all of Hans's information is in the description box. So if you want to learn more about what he's doing, as well as the Tutwiler organization that he is leading. The website is there. The coaching page is there for the guide to finding your innate resiliency after a setback. And I want to thank you again for coming on to the show, Hans. And just give me a moment while I give us a little, just do a little outro real quick. And I'm going to play that beat that I had, which is Remorse.
I like that.
You like the beat?
Thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Oh,
yeah, I do.
Not a problem, sir. So let me play this beat real quick and finish this, do this outro. All right, brothers and sisters. We're closing in on finishing up season 5. We're almost up to our 100th episode in season 5, which will be our 500th episode. And this was Empathy and Leadership with Hans. And I hope that this episode was very edifying for everybody that listened in, as well as I hope that it provided you with great substance. And as always, when you live in the present, there is always an opportunity for a new beginning. And don't look for the light at the end of the tunnel, because the light is and always will be within you. So light up the tunnel and find your way through the darkness. This is ORRA the Informationalist, saying peace, love, and light, and all praises to the Most High in Christ. Shalom, brothers and sisters.